Hello everyone, welcome. It is Thursday, obviously, again, but unlike what I said last week, I'm here, and I'm here with you all instead of off on a shoot. If ever that you needed proof that this stuff is still interrupting things, it's when you get a big shoot cancelled the week before because someone has caught it or got notified of it or whatever else, but there we go. So the good news is it means that we're back on for a Thursday editing session. So we are going to spend the next 1 hour, as we normally do, going through that software. So Capture One. Capture One being the raw editor that's made by the guys in Denmark. And we're going to load up your images and hopefully either fix the problems that you guys have sent in or maybe try and improve some of the aspects of it that maybe have gone a little bit wrong. Overall, don't forget, send in your pictures if you want them edited. We've had a couple of questions from people, actually a few things. So the first being, if you want pictures sent in at the end of these sessions, we always tell you how, but the quick answer is go to paulreeferlive.wetransfer.com and upload them with your name, most important. And we'll try and get as many as we can through. The second question, someone emailed in saying that they didn't get notified of when we go live. So generally speaking, if you go onto my website, you'll see when the next live session is due to be. Obviously, this week was a bit weird, but from there you can link into or back into this. But the easier way is literally if you click on, and I can't remember because I'm not normally on it, the YouTube thing. There's a subscribe thing and there's a little bell. If you click on that, that will tell you, it'll warn you when we're going to do a live session. I don't think it gives you that much notice, but it's maybe, I don't know, half an hour or so, which is better than none. So there we go. Right, Derek, how was the vacation? The vacation's non-existent because I'm still here, unfortunately, but either way, let's get on and edit a few images. So we are going to edit in the current, as of right now, version of Capture One, which is version 21.3 or 14.3 if you look at the About screen in Capture One. The reason for the difference is one is a marketing term, so version 21 is the year 2021, and 14.3 is the technical term, so it's the actual version, software version number. For those of you that are still on 14.2 or even 14.1 or 14, 14.3 gives you a few extras, so Magic Brush, Universal Exporter, catalog subfolders. Being able to count the number of images in the catalog subfolder is priceless. It's the biggest change for me in 14.3, despite all the other toys. However, obviously, there was a bit of an issue with some workflows that came to the forefront as it were a couple of weeks back. So if you are reliant on process recipes being in a tab, you might want to hold off. Capture One have instantly said, we're looking at it, bear with, and they've now come out more recently with a statement that says 14.4, so the next release will include the ability to re-customize your workspace and have that process recipe tab back. If you don't know what I'm talking about at all, then the chances are you're not affected by process recipes being moved into the exporter, so go ahead and update onto 14.3, which is the latest version. If you're still on 13, which is version 20 as it was marketed, or 12 or 11 or 10 or whatever, go into captureone.com, into your account. You can check what your options are for upgrading. Or if you're on subscription, you get it anyway. So your choice. Right, let's get into Capture One. Now that right on cue, I've just got something in my eye. That's always handy when we're editing photos. And we're going to start with Georg's first shot. So there's a question in my head as to whether this is intended to be a focus on the location or the buildings or the sky. My gut feel is it's intended to be on the buildings. But the question that came in was, in general, from an editing point of view, how are we? But then secondly, someone had recommended to Georg about moving maybe the crop to the right-hand side to give it more space. So let's just have a look at before and after, because there's two things I think on this image that we're going to probably have a look at. Georg actually mentioned that they've used he's used deep sky up here. It's probably the right use of it, just to try and get those clouds to pop a bit more. It almost has like a polarizing effect, but digitally, which is kind of good. But there are two issues in here that we'll try and resolve. The first one being actually the shadow tone in this shot. So let me do a before and after. Up here, for those of you that don't know, you've got a before and after option. If you don't have any of the buttons that I have on my toolbar, never forget you can right click, go to customize toolbar, and this will allow you to drag and drop any of the functions that you want. And ones that I would always recommend people put on their toolbar is guides for a start, and also if they don't have before and after, to put that up there too. The reason for guides is you can keyboard shortcut it obviously, but it's a very quick way of getting some vertical and horizontal lines up on the screen, which we can use regardless of whether we're keystoning, but we can use just to make sure things are straight and level. So slightly off on that one. But yeah, having the guides thing up there is kind of handy too. But the before and after, click on there. So we've got our raw with a color space applied, but here's our after, which is basically that raw with any edits that Georg has already done. And when I talk about the shadow tone, what I'm talking about is the flattening that's happened on the shot. And we talked about this a little bit last week, but we'll sort of revisit it with this shot in particular. When you look at an image here, and what I'm going to do just quickly is clone this variant, or actually we'll just reset it. So here's our original. So remember that before and after will still respect your crop. So if you're looking for a true before and after from raw back to after, you have to actually create a new variant. So either clone the variant and reset it, or right click, go to new variant. You'll get the original, and you'll notice there's no change then before and after. And in my original here, we can see we've got some extra space, let's say, for a start, but B, there's a lot of contrast in this shot. So we've got some deep shadows in the buildings, and we've also got obviously some brighter areas up here on the cloud. Nothing's really clipping. So if I look up here on my histogram on the top left, which is probably one of the most important tools that we use, on that histogram, we've got the ability just to see exactly where any one pixel is. And for this purpose here, well, we can see anything up here in the brightest parts up in these clouds. It isn't clipping. It's not at the top right hand side. So if this is a scale from 0 to 255, I'm only worried really if my raw data goes outside of that scale. So below 0 or above 255. And unfortunately, once you get to that stage, some cameras we can recover that dynamic range back a little bit, but once it goes beyond 255 or below 0, we've got no data in that pixel. It's beyond black or beyond white. And up here, our highlights, even on these windows up here, which are just picking up almost sort of specular highlights, we're not really risking anything going massively overblown. Maybe we've got a little bit in there. If I really zoom into here, obviously that particular pixel there might hit, well, even with that, it's not quite there. It's at 222. So I've got room on the right of the histogram to expand the brightness of this image. And moving that brightness up, if I just use exposure to do that, what we're doing is we're shifting the histogram along proportionately. Well, it's almost sliding. We refer to it like on a skateboard. So it's literally moving the data from right to left. But we're keeping some of the contrast because we're keeping the difference between the dark parts and the light parts. So even though the light parts are getting lighter and the dark parts are getting lighter too, they're staying the same distance apart. And what Georg's done in the original edit here is use a little bit of exposure correction, absolutely, but then also used high dynamic range. And high dynamic range allows us, and again, we talk about it in previous sessions, but we can push the highlights down and we can pull the shadows up. So effectively, we're squashing that data in the histogram, not sliding it. We're actually squishing it into the middle. So in other words, reducing contrast. The further apart pixels are in value and tones are in value, the more contrast we have from dark to light. The closer together we move them, and HDR is a massive instigator of that, is unfortunately going to reduce our contrast and reduce the amount of tonal difference we get from the darks to the lights. So in here, this addition of the high dynamic range change, if I undo this temporarily, so to undo any tool temporarily rather than having to redo it, hold down the Option key or the Alt key on your keyboard and hit the Tools Undo button and hold it. So that's without HDR and that's with HDR. And to me, I get why we want to recover some of the shadow detail, but to me, this is verging towards a sort of cartoony look as a result of that HDR. So if I go back to our original and just reset that exposure, this one is in comparison. Let's just pull them up side by side. The original is pretty dark. It could do with being brighter and more light and more open. But I'm not too sure about the amount of HDR recovery that's happened here. So my gut feel is to just back this away probably by half. So we're just going to pull back down to there. And if I still want those shadows to become brighter, I'm going to do that, but I'm going to do it effectively with exposure and contrast. So I'm going to move up our exposure a little bit and also use contrast, which kind of counters what I just said in a way, if you think about it. But what contrast is doing is it's taking the bits to the left of the histogram and making them darker or deeper or richer, and the bits to the right of the histogram and making them brighter and more airy. But at the same time, I've lifted the whole histogram a bit to the right. And if I then compare our sort of HDR version to this version, we have the same amount of detail. We're not losing any detail in this, but I haven't got such a flattened histogram that everything just looks a little bit just almost drawn or line drawn rather than bold. Especially when the image is of steel and glass buildings. I want hard, rich, bold lines. I want to see that texture. I want to see the metal looking contrasty. If I flatten it too much, yeah, we lose some of that, and that's a problem in my head. To that extent, and there's already a bit of clarity and structure on here across the whole image, but I would almost be tempted, specifically on these buildings. I'm just going to draw a new layer, and I'm going to grab a radial mask. So we talked about this last week, but you can invert the mask, or we can flip it, or we can set the default, either way. But I'm just going to position this mask right over the middle of these buildings along here. And this might not quite get it, but we'll see. And I'm just going to turn it so we're on the right angle. And with that mask, in other words, the other thing, to show your mask, obviously, M on the keyboard for mask, M on the keyboard for mask go away, or whatever. If you want the actual tool for it, in 14.3, this moved. This cluster here, or this tool here for the showing mask used to be down here. Instead, it's at the top of the viewer, and this is going to tell you your keyboard shortcut. Grayscale version of the mask is the option, or Alt-M. M turns it on, and M turns it off. Easy. So with this one here, because I've got this area here masked, well, let's just have a look at what we can do with a bit more clarity and actually a bit more contrast. And to me, that then, if this is about the buildings, that then really makes these buildings stand out. So without that layer and with that layer, it's just adding an extra bit of depth into those buildings that we didn't have before. So a couple questions. What's that? 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Okay. So I'm not the only one with a permanent rotating loading indicator above the toolbar. No, you are not. This thing here does my head in. It's been there for a few versions now. It's a background activity thing. It's not stopping anything. There's no process going on. If I go into my window and go to activities, you'll see there are no activities going on. The activity wheel is actually to the right up here. So if you're processing stuff or whatever, then, or generating previews, that's where it would appear. This thing up here, I think, is just coded to annoy people like you and me. I know it's known. I know it's been picked up. I know, in fact, David at Capture One has talked to me about it because I think he's seen it now a few times. But yes, annoying, but not important. It's not actually doing anything that's interrupting what you're doing. Simon's just asked, what's the film curve under the base characteristics? My gut feel, yeah, this is auto. So obviously we've got different film curves. We could have started with linear response, but actually, remember what we're trying to do. We're trying to get contrast. Linear response is going to flatten that image even more. So the auto curve, which is actually film standard in most cases, will put a slight S curve in. So it's going to deepen the shadows and enrich the highlights. Linear response, even with those changes that we've put in, so remember we're changing the film curve underneath all of these existing changes in here is going to flatten and dull things down simply because it's more of a straight line curve. It's not darkening shadows and brightening highlights. It's taking the data almost as close to raw as you can get out of the camera. So in this shot here, because we don't have anything overexposed or blown or under, my gut feel would be leave it on auto or film standard, and then, and go from there. So Joe's just saying, yeah, what's the main subject of the image, buildings or boats? The file name suggests boats. Yeah, I agree the file name says boats. However, this crop that Georg's got at the moment would suggest that it's not necessarily about the boats, because we've got a lot of room, and I'll just show you in here. If we go into our crop, we've got a lot more room here to place those boats as more prominent if we wanted to. So I'm just going to move into the, I guess, the second question that we had, which was, should we leave more room to the right? So first thing to say, regardless of whether it's boats or buildings, yes, in my view, I would leave more room to the right for one simple reason. There's a nice end to this little floating pontoon that we don't see in this crop because it cuts off towards the edge. And I like completeness. Maybe I'm just weird, but to me, I would be almost in a 2x1 crop at this point here, but just to come out maybe to there, and that gives me a nicer finish here than what we had here. This feels very tight. And again, if it's about these boats as much as it is about the buildings, having them so close down this bottom, it almost makes them ancillary to the scene. You wouldn't normally have the subject of a scene quite so close to the edge. And again, this is then purely down to what the intention is. But to me, if we wanted to do this crop and have a bit more space to the right to give this some breathing room here, I'd equally be tempted just to pull this down, if not that much, then certainly give it a bit more breathing space down to there. In fact, I think we've just added a bit onto that side, which is a bit annoying. Half a lamppost. No one likes half a lamppost. And then we get to there. So I go from there, which is a relatively flattened version. It's for the right reasons. We've recovered all the shadow, recovered the highlights. We've got all the data back into that nice, neat middle space. But you lose the contrast that was there, especially when you're dealing, as I say, with buildings which are glass and steel. They're full of contrast and texture and lines and edges, and this just flattens them. Whereas if we use that contrast, they stand out a little bit more. So that's probably where I would end up on there. Joe just learned something. What what did you learn? Right, on Joe's second question though, grab mask to darken the foreground, potentially. So it depends on that subject. So if we didn't want the foreground to be quite so prominent, then of course you can add a whole new layer. So new layer on here, put a soft gradient in, make sure it is soft up to there. And then with that gradient, just a subtle, very subtle drop in there. Equally with the sky, I'm seeing slight tinges of green up in there, up there in the cast. So I'd be tempted just to pull that tint up a bit, not too much, but on the background, just to get some of that green out of the white and try and neutralize it a little bit. So, and then where are we, Derek? How do you resolve the clipped boats to the right edge of the frame? I don't. Is the answer. So I had a look at this before. At any point, so when I come out of this crop, let's just go into our crop here. It doesn't really matter at what point I try and cut this to the right, and this is, I think, why Georg stopped there, just so you didn't have half a boat. The fact is, you're always going to be cropping or clipping something on this right hand side. My gut feel is, somewhere maybe around there. At least don't have the start of a big boat coming into the frame. That's pretty neat there. We've got two complete boats and a sort of the stern of one of them somewhere. But to me, that sort of works. And there you go, Joe. That's what you learned. The 5 boats is the building's name. There we go. I didn't know that either. So again, we're making lots of assumptions here, but my assumption being we want to keep contrast. We want some space to give our subject to breathe, and we believe the subject is those buildings. So I would then go from there up to there, with or without that gradient in the front. Okay, David, is there more on the buildings, or is that just YouTube? It's probably just YouTube. No, there's a bit on there, actually. Yep, you're right. So there's a little bit of patterning on here. Yeah, you're going to get that. What sensor are we on? Sony A7 II. Is that the S2 or the A7 II? I think it's the A7 II. I wish they wouldn't put this M stuff. Anyway, so yeah, unfortunately, trying to fix that is a bit of a challenge. There are tools that do it very well out there, but you're always going to be losing some stuff to demoiring or whatever you want to call it. Where are we? Oh, you're right, Roger. Adjust the verticals of the left building. So yeah, I forgot to come back to that. Going back to our guides that we were using before. So on my vertical guide specifically, this right-hand building looks about right. Number 4, I guess, looks right. Number 3 looks okay. Number 2 looks okay. Number 1 is leaning quite a bit, and that's actually concerning me a bit, because it means we've got probably some distortion as well as keystoning. Distortion correction's on. So if we were to undo that, we get more of a bend. So it's not going to help us doing more than that. But we can do a tiny bit more keystoning if we need to on this shot. So it's already been keystoned. We can see that because we've got the weird trapezoid shape from the crop. But you can see here, this keystone line here is a little bit off. We're not following that line of pillars. So I'm just going to move it to the left a little bit. Make sure your amount is set to 100. And then you're going to cleaner, hopefully, line from that keystone as a result. Remember when you keystone just to revisit your crop, just in case things like that lamppost have crept in. And also, once you've checked and made sure that one building is now correct, so this one is now straight, good, make sure the other ones are too. I've had that a few times where correcting one on the left-hand side has completely screwed up the right. And I've just removed my guide, which wasn't very clever. So if you want to add guides, you'll find it in the view menu, so we can add that vertical guide back. Right, let's move on to Earl's shot of some trees. So, Earl, welcome back. You've been away. You didn't get permission either. So, what can we do with this shot? Now, I'm going to experiment a little bit with this shot. We wouldn't normally do this. So as a general rule, we want to keep things as close to what we saw as possible and as close to, what we tried to capture at that time. Sometimes it doesn't quite work because our exposure is a little bit off, or, the lighting conditions are impossible. But to me, there's a lot of room in this shot to be able to make a few tweaks that will have an artistic impact to it rather than a corrective impact to it. So what I mean by that is we can spend our time trying to correct back to what was there originally, and it's always difficult to do that when I wasn't there. But what we can also do instead is use our time to move an image into a mood that's pretty cool to look at, potentially. So I'm going to clone this variant. We're going to do a quick couple of checks. So we're F10, maybe there's some diffraction. The first thing that I'm going to show you, though, in this shot is that there is an issue here with focus. Well, sorry, not an issue, but one thing to just be aware of. Our back trees here are obviously out of focus, even at F10. This tree here is quite sharp. This tree here is very sharp, and then our tree here isn't. So that then gives me a challenge in terms of what subject we need to make out of this scene. And it doesn't make sense for this front one to be the subject. It might have done with a row of them slowly falling off. But in general terms, we kind of want the most the most in focus object to be our subject unless we're doing something abstract with it. So in this case, it kind of forces my hand. I can't really make this one our subject. It's a little bit out of the focal plane. There's possibly a little bit of diffraction in there, but it's not going to change much. Instead of, and I've seen this before, instead of trying to get more in focus by using sharpening, so this tree is now a bit sharper, but ooh, look what we've done to that one. Don't do that. We're going to work with what we've got. And that is this tree here being the subject of our photo. And everything's going to lead towards that. So let's start with our color tab. So normally we'd be on our exposure tab. We're going to start with color. I could change to one of the Fujifilm simulations. Remember that your auto curve on a Fuji shot isn't necessarily going to be your film standard curve. In this case, it's actually not even, because the Fuji camera will record the Fuji film profile within the raw file, and that's what will be loaded in. You can still use linear response. You're going to see it's a lot flatter. So that's with, and that's without. So in other words, with the auto curve set in, with linear response set in. And although the auto curve has given us a lot of contrast, I kind of like the linear response flattening on here, and I'll show you why in a second. Secondly, let's look at our white balance. So this is obviously as shot. I'm guessing, unless Earl typed that specific number in, that it was on auto white balance on the camera. Either that or he's very precise when he's shooting. But that auto white balance is probably right in terms of, if we look out here at this sunlight out here fitting or hitting this tree in the background, that looks kind of warm and soft light. So I'm guessing the camera's got it right. But I've got some room here to maneuver with our overall white balance, and I can make us look a little bit more dusky and spooky if I want to. Color balance. So we covered this last week in quite a lot of depth. Color balance itself is a part of color grading an image. Part of it obviously is the auto white balance, or the white balance tool itself. Part of it is the color editor, but part of it is the color balance. So what we can do with color balance is split the different elements of the image to be bluer or redder or greener or pinker or whatever, based on whether they're the shadows, the midtones, or the highlights. But before I do that, I'm going to address that histogram first. So bear in mind, these three tools will allow us to change the shadow separately to the highlights and separately to the midtones. If everything is sat in the midtones, kind of like it is here, that doesn't help me. So I've chosen to almost compress things, so not use the auto S-curve out there, which has effectively moved everything into the middle. So just be careful if you're using color balance tools and everything's sat in one portion of the histogram, you're only going to be shifting one part of it. So with this change, I'm going to up our contrast a little bit, which is going to introduce part of an S-curve, but more importantly, it's going to stretch this a bit. And then I'm going to use our levels. And our levels is going to allow me to drag this right-hand side and drag the left-hand side of our histogram across. So we're increasing contrast. And that's the key part with levels. We're either increasing or decreasing contrast. So with that done, what I've effectively done is spread and stretch that histogram a little bit. I'm going to check that we don't have any overexposures. So I haven't pushed it too far, which we haven't. But we've stretched that histogram to have more in the shadows and the highlights while keeping some in the midtones. In fact, we can stretch the shadows a bit more. Yeah, quite like that. So already we're going from there to there, and this feels like a bit more of a rich sort of lush forest, as it were, rather than the flat and sunny one. Doesn't mean the flat and sunny one is wrong. By all means, keep the flat and sunny one. It's just, if we're going to play, let's play. So with our color balance, I can take our midtones and I can warm them up a little bit. I can take our shadows and I can cool them down a little bit. We don't want them to go pinky blue. We want them to go sort of greeny, foresty blue, let's say. Highlights, so that includes the stuff up here, and just be careful. Look, my exposure warning's on up there. So just be aware that that highlight, as I start to shift the colors, remember what your exposure warning's telling you. It's one or more channels is above 255. So think about this. As I'm moving that color around for my highlights, look, nothing's clipped. Now a load of stuff has clipped. Why? Well, because I'm increasing the amount of red and orange in this highlight, and as I move over here, look at that top readout up here that gives us our RGB numbers. We're now hitting 255 on red. Well, of course, if I move our highlights to be more blue, less red, we don't hit 255, so it doesn't clip. So even though this is about color, just be careful that you're not clipping certain colors, or if you are, that you're comfortable with that clip as you do it. So that's where I'm going to leave there in terms of the color balance. So let's just do quick without, that was before, and with, okay, and then back to our original, and with, and to me this starts to feel a bit more spooky, foresty like, but that's, again, with personal choice here. So with that done, let's now look at what we do with the focus. And one way is to use a vignette, obviously. The other way is, let's call it a manual vignette. So I can draw a wonderful mask over here. Remember in Capture One, if you choose either the brush or the gradient tools, or even Magic Brush, it will create a layer for you the first time. If you use those tools later on a different layer, it's going to replace the mask with whatever tool you're now using. So just don't get into the habit of relying on Capture One to create that layer for you. It will the first time, but from then on, the risk, and it is a risk, is that you start overwriting the mask that you already drew on a layer. So we're going to call this one Tree Focus. I'm going to soften this down, so really soft into here. The difference, or the distance between this inner circle and the outer circle, is going to tell us how long it takes to get from 0% impact across to 100% impact on the right hand side. So with that done, let's now darken with exposure the rest of the shot a little bit. And I'm actually going to spread this out wider so it's not quite so tight on just that tree, but we're getting a nice feeling of leading into it. On top of that, of course, now we've darkened the rest of the image, we can actually afford, bearing in mind this top part which had our overexposure included is darkened too, to push up our brightness of the whole image. If I don't like that, and the reason I'm sort of going, maybe not, oh, sorry, on our background, push up our brightness, there we go. Brightness is a flattening tool. So it doesn't shift the histogram. What it does is it effectively squashes it. So again, just like we talked about in the previous image, if you start squashing content into the middle of that histogram, that squashing is getting rid of contrast. And this image, we've just spent a lot of time adding contrast into it. So instead of the brightness tool, we are going to use the exposure tool. By pulling up the whole image by as a third of a stop, so 0.29, we can now pull down the rest of the image, especially the outside, by, let's say, 1.29, so one and a third stops. If I don't like how dark this bit is, remember, this is a mask just like any. So I can, if I choose to, go to my eraser, click once, it's going to say, do you want to rasterize the mask? What it means by that is once I do this and rasterize it, this stops behaving like a circular radial mask. So if I go back to the radial mask, I don't have my controls back. It's now behaving as if I drew it. And the result of that is with my eraser, if I put a low opacity in, maybe down to there, I can now selectively remove parts of the image from that radial mask. Your choice how much to remove, but we kind of get to there. Maybe I want some more in this one. Well, remember, this one was caught by the radial, so I was using the radial kind of to be lazy to a certain extent, but I can add extra stuff in. So let's go back to my brush, not magic brush, just a normal brush. Nice big brush, really soft edges, low opacity. I'm going to leave the flow up at 100. That's personal choice. Don't have to do that. And I'm just going to add in some extra parts of that mask that we drew. And if we look in a minute at what I've just done, so what I'm doing is just clicking in a way that adds a little bit of, I guess, softness to the edges. I'm going to switch to show a grayscale mask, and you can see what I've done. So what started out as a really neat oval, effectively. I've now added in on this edge. I've added in on this edge. I've got specific little spots where we've added and deleted different parts of the mask. And the result is that I've now got a very specific targeted mask over that tree that I didn't have before. If I don't like how much this has changed, I can obviously back that away a little bit. I'm going to. So one of the other reasons for doing this on layers rather than on the background is that we can obviously back away some of the changes that we've made if it's becoming too much of a difference between the two. With the rest of this mask, so remember I've masked the external part of it. So let's right click. In fact, sorry, let's create a new mask. So we did this last week, wasn't it? So we're going to have a tree mask and a not tree mask. So here I'm going to copy the mask from our tree and I'm going to invert that mask. So now I have a mask that covers the tree that I want in focus. I'm just going to erase a little bit more to the right. Where are we? Nice soft one there. There we go. Good. And then with that one, I'm just going to zoom in a bit, because you should zoom in when you're doing this stuff, and pull up a little bit of structure and a bit of clarity just to focus on that tree. Question from Diraj. So the difference between opacity and flow. There is, if you go onto the playlist that we have called Pro Tips, you'll see one about brush control. And we go into a lot of depth about brush control. However, in a very, very quick whirlwind fashion, let's just go through a quick lesson in, oops, sorry, didn't mean to clone that. I want to reset that. Quick lesson in opacity and flow. So with my grayscale mask enabled, I'm going to create a new layer. So you're not going to be able to see anything because, well, this is the grayscale mask and there's nothing drawn. So here's my brush. I'm going to set my opacity to 100 and my flow to 100. I'm going to use a, let's say, a medium hardness on the brush and draw a line. So we can see that that has drawn a 100% line, soft-ish edge, but 100% in one go. So when I click and hold across one, I get one big line that's solid. If I change my opacity to, let's say, 30, draw that same line. So click once, hold down, and go over. That's drawn 30%. If I click once, hold down and go over, and go back again, and go back again, and back again, and back again, it doesn't matter how many times I go back over that, it's never going to increase beyond 30%. Let me let go of the mouse, click again. It's adding effectively another 30%. Doesn't matter how many times I go over it, holding the mouse down, it's only ever going to add 30%. Let go, click again, another 30%. Again, go over it as many times as you want, but it's only going to add 30. And again, you get the idea, and again. So it needs a mouse click to add opacity one at a time. Flow, different. So I'm going to set my opacity to 100 and flow maybe down to, let's keep it low, 10. So same line, draw across, and keep it held down, and keep it held down, and keep it held down, keep it held down. With flow, every time I go over the same spot, it's adding a bit more with my mouse held down. And it builds up until it hits the ceiling that I set for opacity. So one is a single stripe, effectively. With each brush stroke, it adds a layer of opacity. The other is flow, which is with every time I go over the same spot, it's going to add 10%, 10%, 10% until it hits this ceiling. And the way you use them together, let's go to 50% opacity and let's say 20% flow. So now, over it and over it and over it, and then it hits a certain point. And that point, so it doesn't matter now how many times I go over it, unlike this one that hits 100, this one, the most it's ever going to hit is 50. So you've got a flow that controls how many or how much is added with each overlay that I use the brush for, up to a maximum of opacity. If I set an opacity that's lower than 100, that's the most it's going to go, regardless of flow, regardless of how many times I go over it. It's going to hit that and stop. With opacity, each brush stroke effectively, even if my flow is at 100 and my opacity is at 20, it doesn't matter how many times I go over that spot, it's never going to hit above that limit there, 23. Click again, another layer. Click again, another layer, and again. So opacity per click, flow per stroke, effectively. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, though, go on to the pro tips videos that we've got. It's about a 15-20 minute video that will cover exactly this. And you'll see. So let's just turn off our grayscale mask and zoom out. Oops. Right, back to our picture. Almost finally, we're kind of there now. With the knot tree, I actually want to warm this up just a tiny bit. So remember, I can change my white balance independently of the rest of the shot too. I might want, and again, it all comes down to choice. I might want to play with dehaze a little bit. Not on the knot tree though, on the background. So play with dehaze just to crisp this up a little bit. And if I don't like that difference again with our white balance, well, we can just shift that. Why are we getting a shift in there? That's a bit weird, isn't it? Oh, do you know what? That's what's confusing me. I named them the wrong way. That's why it's going warmer and cooler. So what I want is the knot tree bit. I called this the wrong one. We'll actually call this one tree. And we'll call this one knot tree focus. There we go. Confusing me. With my own changes. So tree, I'm just going to cool down a little bit. Knot tree focus, probably warm just a touch to there. So to me, that's kind of where I'd end. We might want to add a little bit of a gradient up top, a really, really, really soft gradient, just to back this off a little bit. And again, make that a nice long sweep so we don't notice the gradient creeping in. We might want to put in an extra little bit of dodge and burn. If I didn't want to do it myself, I could do it with our style brush. So we can go to our burn brush here, which is preset. A really, really low flow, going back to Diraj's question. So every time I go over this, it's adding a little bit more into that flow. And what I'm doing is just isolating that path through into the forest a little bit. And just getting rid of some of these highlights that are on the edges. Oops. Make everyone a little bit sick by moving the window. Sorry. So with that change along here, that just gives us a bit more depth into that scene. But going back to what I originally said, this is choice. This is personal choice. This is about how you want it effectively to feel. That's the original. And we could absolutely just go into here and say, right, well, let's fix our standard stuff. So let's pull back some highlights. Let's add a bit of clarity into there. Let's add a bit of contrast. Let's reduce down here. And we probably get a pretty sympathetic view of what was there. To me, I kind of like the feeling of something like that a little bit more, especially with the woods. So that's personally where I would go to. But again, I wasn't there. I don't know what it looked like. I'm to a certain extent playing with that grading that we've done with the forest. But yeah, and to Matt's point, yeah, amazing how much the edit changes the mood of the scene entirely. So it's the same raw data. We haven't changed the raw. This is literally that data that was there in the first place, just with some little tweaks, and that's a pretty big change. It's probably one of the bigger changes that we'll do. You've then got a question as to whether or not you want to play with, cropping and stuff. Maybe that's a nice sort of tight crop. But with trees, I kind of like the tall crop. That kind of works for me, I think. There we go. So yeah, play with that one, Earl. Well, I'll send you the EIP so you can take what I've done and make it better. Right, move on to Eric's shot. So this one, unfortunately, Eric, is going to be quite quick based on your question. So the question is, so this is a panoramic that Eric has sent in. It's a combination of several images. Obviously, you can see from the the sort of 180-degree angle across it. It's been stitched externally and then brought back into Capture One. And the question was, can we fix this bright spot in the middle? The challenge with this is, and if you look at what the guys at Capture One are talking about, yes, they've announced in terms of what they believe priorities in terms of photo editing are, and it includes, can we improve HDR? Can we improve things like panoramic stitching and whatever else? But at the moment in Capture One, you have to edit each individual image separately. When you do that, it means that you're getting slight deviations. For instance, if I've got one shot here that stops on the left of these clouds, so let's imagine I had a sort of break point for this image that was here. On the left-hand side, I've got a bright area. On the right-hand side, it's a bit dark. On the next image, maybe on the right-hand side, we've got a bright area, and the left-hand side, it's a bit dark. So it can be difficult to put in things like gradient filters because it's changing between the images. So the short answer is, can we fix that stuff after it's been manipulated in a stitching program? Possibly not as well as you'd like. We don't have access to the same dynamic range in terms of exposure pullback. We don't have access certainly to white balance in the same way. If I change the white balance on this shot, we're not going from blue to yellow. We're going from green to pink, I guess, and tint starts behaving funnily as well. So you lose some of the tools as a result of bringing it back in as a PNG. That's not actually, however, my biggest concern. My biggest concern with this one is the amount of sharpening that's been done. And I don't know whether these were sharpened as an individual frame and the Pano stitching has just used whatever sharpening it was given, or whether it's been sharpened again, but this is over sharp. We can see there are now artifacts of sharpening over here. We've got these halos over the edges of the forest on the top. These shouldn't be pixelated. So it's been over sharpened at some step in the process. So for me, Eric, I'd potentially go back to some of the originals if it is in there. If not, then in the stitching software. Reduce that sharpening down and maybe look at whether or not you can put a gradient filter in to help with that sky. If you can't, and we're stuck with this, then a new layer, and this is probably the best you're going to get, use the radial filter, pull that radius all the way out. We can either invert it or we can switch it around, but either way, really, really soft, because we don't want it to be obvious that there's a massive, great big radial filter on there. And with that, if we use exposure, it's not going to do quite such a good job as the raw. Brightness is probably going to be a better fix for something that's already been manipulated. We could potentially try our deep sky brush. So let's make a bit bigger here. And, this may go wrong, but we'll see. That might, doing pretty good. That might give you a lot more clarity over those clouds. So I'm doing it very rough at this distance, but you can obviously do it a lot cleaner when you're zoomed in. Although it hasn't done a bad job. If we wanted to exclude, for instance, the bits that I've brushed over here, don't forget you can still apply a luma range onto a style brush. So we've got deep sky on here. I can go to my luma range, go to display mask, and I want to include everything bright, but start to remove the darkest parts out of here. The problem being that sometimes on a non-raw file, the luma range doesn't behave quite as we'd expect. I've seen that a few times, but that's doing a pretty good job there. Apply that so it doesn't now include the stuff that's on the horizon that we don't want inside that mask. And we get to arguably a better place. Just get rid of our guides. So there was before, there's after, but it's not going to give you the same amount of control as you would have doing it in the raw edit in the first place. You could go into here into your color editor. We could pull up some saturation, down some lightness. I'm on that layer, remember, which has got the area all over it. But again, it's just not going to be as good a result as what we would get if we'd done that on the original raws to send into the stitching process. Joe, where are we? What about the burn brush? Yeah, we can try it. You can probably sense from my tone that I'm not holding out much hope, but yes, we can try the burn brush. So up here, we can burn down in here. The problem with the burn brush, remember, is it's not just going to burn the sky, it's also going to burn the clouds. So we go from clouds that are nice and fluffy and white to being quite dull and grey because we've burned the entire area. So you'll end up trying to burn around the clouds and stuff like that. It's just, my worry with these things is we start chasing the impossible, and you're better off sometimes just going back a couple steps, fixing it at source, and then moving on from there. Paulie, yes, it's a PNG file, so it's having sent out a load of individual frames out to an external stitch, bringing it back in as a PNG file, as a combined stitch. So it's done a good job of joining all those files together. But unfortunately, what we're now seeing is the result of having bright areas and dark areas across. As I'm guessing the sun was up here, so you're seeing literally the sky changes brightness as you go. But because this is no longer a raw, we're quite limited in some of the tools that we would normally use to fix it. But yes, burn, unfortunately, Joe, isn't going to help you because it does it indiscriminately. It literally just burns every single value and lowers it down. The burn brush, just so you're all very clear, is nothing more than exposure minus 0.2. That is all it is. It's not doing anything other than that. It's not clever. It's just a quick way of doing a quick reduce exposure. Kind of like we did with Earl's shot here. But in here I was sort of brushing in and then pulling down exposure by 1.29. The burn brush does the same thing by 0.2, but just in little increments. So it's a shortcut. Right, Lukas. Where are we? Sorry. One question from Simon. Color balance, highlight reduction. Potentially. So if we pulled down, in fact, no, ironically, it's not a highlight. That's the problem. So it's actually, I think, in the here, the sky is actually in the midtones. The highlight would be the cloud. So actually there is an argument that says we could pull up the clouds as a result of using that color balance tool. Yep. But that's not going to help us with those midtones. And if we start pulling down the midtones, we start to affect, just too much. Carol, the tip that we used to use a long time ago is using the skin tone tool. So let's just create a new layer. Skin tone tool. I'm going to caveat this before we do this, which is the answer is go back to the raws. Full stop. So what we're doing at the moment is experimenting with stuff that's not going to yield the best result. But if we have to, if we're stuck with that PNG, then yes, we could potentially, let's take the skin tone tool. I just need to make sure we're brushed over, oops, I'm at low flow, brushed over all of this area here. And we've chosen the blue in the sky here, and we're going to tell it to keep all of this blue uniform in saturation and in lightness and in color to a certain extent. We could increase that saturation, reduce that lightness. So we're getting smoother for sure. Yep, it's a good call, Carol. So that's before, that's after. But look at what's happening with the clouds, because they're also in part on that blue spectrum. They're picking up some of that light. So we're losing some of the definition then as a result. And that's what I refer to when I say, just be careful that we're not chasing something that just would be easier to go back, revisit it with a tweak. Use the skin tone tool to even up all of the stuff in the sky on the raws for sure. That would be a good move, just to get that balance correct, and then apply it to the rest of them. But doing this from a PNG is going to be painful. Right, Lucas's cave, let's call it that. So Lucas's question was about split toning this, and we'll do that in a second. But also there was an issue where he could see, I think, some red color in this water down here, and I can see where it's coming from. There's sort of pinky red stuff in there. But in general terms, so his question was, is the approach right, I guess, which was, let's first of all create a new filled layer. So I can do this and undo. The approach that he wanted to use was, can we pull the shadows down to be cooler, to make it look more like a cave? Yes. Can we pull the highlights to be a bit warmer? Yes. But here's my first problem. The first thing we've got to do on this shot is fix it so I can see what's going on. So what I am going to do, and we're going to just talk about this a second, shadows up is going to lift everything in the bottom colors or bottom tones up into the middle. Black up is going to pull the very darkest parts of those tones up into the middle. That's what I'm probably going to use on this shot. If I use shadow, everything just becomes a lot happier, but that's not the feeling of a cave. So I don't want to use too much shadow lifting because that's going to pull up the lower midtones as well. I just want to see some of the detail in these darkest parts here. So I'm going to pull up the black there. That gets our rock detail back. I don't need to see every bit of detail in the rock, but I need to see there is some detail there. Otherwise it's just flat and blackened. Got this person out here. Whether we heal them or not, we'll decide later, I guess. But overall, that's given us a sort of bluey tone to the cave and some warmer highlights. But I'm sat thinking, do we need to do it in color balance, or could we just do that with white balance? So if our overall feel is to get this cooler, then let's get it cooler. Let's get back to there. Okay, now on top of that white balance change, so we haven't moved much. We've gone down by about, where are we, 600? Yeah. And a little bit of a tint change. Now with that overall change, which incidentally will have helped with this reddish color down here, because remember with the white balance change, everything shifts, not just the shadows, midtones or highlights. So with that change, we can now pull our shadows to be a bit cooler, not too much, just down to there. We might want to reduce their brightness a touch, but just bear in mind we're almost undoing what I did with the HDR tool. So just be careful that we're not, flip-flopping between the two. Highlights. Let's pull them a bit warmer, like you said. So let's go maybe out towards the yellowy orangey sort of color. And midtones. So what sits in the midtones? Well, it's actually the water. That's the interesting bit. So if you look on this histogram here, where are the midtones? In the middle. Where is the water? In the middle. So I can control our watercolor almost separately to everything else. So this light up here is in the highlights, but it's the midtones which are changing the color of that water. So if I move the midtones to be blue, pink, red, or whatever, that's the color that the water's going to. And that's what doesn't help you. So just be aware that even though your eye looks at this and says that water is bright, the bright water isn't necessarily the same as a highlight. A highlight is something that sits in the top quarter of your histogram. This water does not. It sits in the midtones. So just be careful that when you're using the color balance, in fact, it's making not much change. The highlights will pick up some of this because it's not binary. It's sort of a ramp. So it sort of covers the top quarter and then fades off. Midtones covers sort of here to here and then ramps up. And the same with shadows. So highlights will affect other areas of the image, but it's not in isolation of anything else. So I'd sort of maybe get to there. And not much else in terms of pulling up this cave. Now, beyond that, if I wanted to then look at what we can do out here, we can use a luma range. So I can create a new filled layer. So we'll call this one global adjustments. This one we'll call highlights. And with our highlights, I'm going to choose a luma range, click on display mask, and I want to see everything that's not the cave. So all of this stuff. We're going to have some problems with some shadows down there, but I can use a fall off that will help. And apply that. With this mask now applied, I'm not sure why that's taking quite so much time to think about it, but it did. Weird. With this stuff applied, going back to Lukas's first point, is we can warm up those highlights using actually white balance rather than the color tone tool. So we go from there to there. we have got that cool cave wall feel about it. In fact, we can sort of yo-yo these a little bit, so we can cool down the overall image a bit more. We can increase our brightness just a touch, and then go back to our highlights and warm them up a little bit if we want to. That's the key thing. But this is down to you then in terms of personal preference. This to me has gone a little bit muddy as a result of that. So actually where I would be is almost taking on this layer, our what we call highlights, taking our midtones, which is where they sit, and increasing them a little bit, and maybe even just offsetting that color there. So we pull our midtones back down into that bluey green area if they start to pick up any warmth from that white balance change. But that's where I go from there to there. It's not a huge change, it's sort of from there into there, but it feels like it's now that sort of cold, dark cave rather than here, and also pulling up some of the detail on the left. Where are we? Derek might work in black and white. It could do. If I were to just very quickly, just conscious of time, pick up maybe a neutral black and white here. We could pick up a bit more clarity in there, a bit more structure as a result of it being in black and white. Maybe that adds something. I personally like the color. I think it adds something to it. But, you know, between the two, up to you. I'm not too precious about it being black and white or color, but my gut feel would be the color's probably the better call. Okay, so that's it for us today. So that's Lukas's cave. Eric, you may have to go back to the raws to fix that problem if that's not going to do what you want it to do. Earl's trees, which are quite a lot different when they started, and Georg's 5 boats, which are actually 5 buildings. So we've all learned something today, including Joe. So cool. Right. So that's it for today. Obviously, between now and next time, you are all welcome into that Facebook group. So Facebook.com, you can search for it. It'll come up. We've got a new set of series stuff that we're going to work on in the next couple of weeks, which is quite cool. So those of you that are in that group will get to see what the plans are for that. If you're not, you're welcome to join, or you'll see those series start to pop up in the future. But between now and next time we see each other, or I see you, or other way around, obviously we've got those pro tips guides. So like I mentioned to, I can't remember who it was, sorry, but we've got the pro tips guides. Oh, it was Diraj, that will cover things like brushes and clarity and so on in specific cases. So they're 15-20 minutes, so use them. They're free, just use them and learn stuff. And then if you want your image to be edited, then send it in, ready for next time. So paulreeflive.wetransfer.com. Send us the raw or send us the EIP with some edits done. Include your name, please. If you don't include your name, we can't include your image. It's that simple. And we will take as many of them as we can and work through them from next time onwards. And next time, I think we're going to start with Paula's shot, just as a bit of a heads up. Cool. Right. In between then and now, take care, and we'll see you next, I think, week. But if not, then next time, check online and you'll see it. Cheers, everyone. Bye-bye.